Greetings and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Jimmy Bettcher and our guest today is Scott Shackelford. Scott is an assistant professor of business law and ethics here at the Kelley School of Business. He obtained his master's in international relations from Cambridge, a law degree from Stanford, and is a PhD candidate in international relations at Cambridge. Professor Shackelford's current research grows from his doctoral dissertation on the governance of global common pool resources and focuses on cybersecurity and privacy. Scott received a faculty research grant from CIBER to help complete research for his forthcoming book, Cyber Peace: Countering Cyber Attacks in International Law, Business, and Relations. He joins us today to discuss the findings. Scott, welcome.
Thank you. It's very good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, first off, to provide some scope, how big are the issues and how important is cybersecurity in the global economy today?
It's incredibly important, right? So when you talk about cybersecurity, you can go a number of different routes. In my research, I look at kind of the whole array. Cyber crime alone, it's a huge problem, right? The Obama administration cited a figure this last year of $1 trillion lost to cyber criminals. Just in the last year alone, that's a figure larger than the global illegal drugs market.
Wow.
So it's a huge problem, and that's just the crime front. You talk about espionage, you talk about cyber war, cyber terrorism, they all kind of present unique challenges and opportunities for both states and law enforcement.
So how big are the risks then for companies versus states, and how do they face similar risks or different risks in terms of cybersecurity?
It's a great question, and it's a tough one to answer. Yeah. It depends. Lawyers love to say it depends, right? And that's true in this context. In my book, I have separate chapters on kind of the cyber risk to both firms and nations. It depends what firm you're talking about. If you're talking about a firm like Google, it's clear that they have to prepare for some of the most sophisticated cyber attacks, which include cyber attacks emanating from states. For example, allegedly China. We were talking about kind of smaller firms like local companies based here in Indianapolis, for example. They're going to face a different array. It's going to be things like botnets, spam, kind of stuff like that, different type of attacks. And judging by the type of attack coming in, that really does a lot to judge your response and what you can do about it.
Well, I mean, since the focus of our program is more on private sector businesses and whatnot, what can companies do, especially in Indiana, to protect themselves from cybercrime or any other cybersecurity issues?
It's a fantastic question. There's not one easy answer.
Sure.
I wish there was.
Yeah.
We could go out and start a great consulting business right now. A couple things, right? The classic kind of approach and the classic strategy is to be as proactive as possible. So a lot of firms can be very reactive when it comes to cybersecurity. There's a big data breach like what happened to Sony earlier this year, or back in 2011 when there was a big breach. Over 100 million customer records were lost and their stock price took a big hit. And only after that did they hire on a chief information security officer, which they should have done to begin with. So be proactive, invest in it to begin with. Talking about chief information security officers, organizationally, it's quite challenging to kind of get on top of cybersecurity. So having a point person, especially at kind of the C-level, that can be a huge asset. It's also important to conduct kind of cost-benefit analysis consistently in the organization. So if you can have a good sense whether or not, for example, insurance is a good buy, that could be a really helpful thing to help mitigate the cost of cyber attacks after they happen.
Are there any good examples of companies or firms or organizations that have done excellent jobs of being proactive or dealing with cybersecurity issues? Yeah,
there are a couple, and they're kind of household names that you recognize pretty easily. So, for example, Microsoft has a secure development lifecycle that they started kind of the early 2000s. Before that, Microsoft had a pretty bad reputation when it came to security. It just wasn't something, and they weren't alone. A lot of technology companies were the same way. It just wasn't something they looked a lot at. There was something called technical debt that had been happening for a long time and building up. And as a result of that, they had to kind of play catch up. And they did that by creating the secure development lifecycle. It basically requires security kind of built in from the get-go rather than as an afterthought. And they've kind of shared the same strategy with other tech companies, and other companies are kind of taking that idea up much more wholeheartedly. But it's still quite haphazard.
Yeah, certainly. To go dig a little deeper, what are some of the root causes or maybe gaps in governance in the cyber world that has allowed these cyber attacks to proliferate?
Yeah. So internet governance and cybersecurity are kind of strange bedfellows, right? Because they absolutely don't go together. just provide a little bit of background, internet governance as an area is extraordinarily complex, right? There's a lot of different actors out there kind of shaping the regulatory environment. You have states, certainly, which are taking a much more assertive role in regulating online, the U.S. included, but also, you name it, China, for example. We look at the Arab Spring this past year, Egypt cut off its internet connection during that, so states are becoming much more assertive. There's international organizations out there, like the International Telecommunication Union. There's nonprofits like ICANN, which kind of deals with the domain name system. They recently made some news, both good and bad, when it comes to kind of new top-level domains. So having, instead of .com, having like .kodak, something like that. So it's actually a nonprofit set up originally by the U.S. government to handle that, but that's kind of its own kettle of fish. There's an Internet Governance Forum, which brings in much more of the private sector. So it's a huge array of actors that you have to corral to help kind of increase cybersecurity, which can be quite difficult. ICANN has done some stuff with that recently that's been encouraging. And there's a more technical side of all this to deal with the communication side of the internet governance, which is the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And they've put out some good proposals about how, for example, to fix flaws in the domain name system, things like that. But they're just proposals. They're kind of voluntary. So there's no force out there saying you have to take up this or that.
In an ideal world, what kinds of steps do you think would be necessary to fill those gaps in internet governance to improve global security?
That's the million-dollar question, right? We could go down a couple different roads, right? One classic one that's couched a lot and talked about is having a new treaty for cybersecurity. We have a treaty already called the European Convention on Cybercrime. You can, judging by the title, it's a European treaty, but the U.S. has ratified it, as have a few other non-European countries. The blowback is, and the resistance to that in the developing world especially, is that it's predominantly centered on European countries. So the idea is to create a more global standard. Politically, that's quite difficult to do. The politics behind this is divergent, to say the least, and it's an area where, as states want to exercise more sovereignty, they're really reticent to kind of curtail that kind of at the outset. So you can go down the road of a treaty. In the long term, that might happen. In the short term, Professor Joseph Nye, among others, have really argued that it's just not politically likely. So the other alternative is what I talk about in the book, and it's really an application of what's called polycentric governance.
Okay.
And this is something that Professor Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics right here at IU a few years ago, kind of as an idea she put out there, along with her colleagues and many others who have worked on this over really decades, beginning in the 60s. And this idea that because it's going to be oversimplification, but to start local governance is extremely important to this. To start small, but to start somewhere. So if you're waiting for this international treaty to promote cybersecurity, you're going to be waiting a long time. So actors all the way up from you and me to states to regional organizations like the EU and NATO, on up to the International Telecommunication Union. We can all do things to help secure cyberspace, and we should. We shouldn't be waiting for Godot.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Scott, unfortunately, we're out of time for today, but we really, really appreciate your insights, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. If you have topics that you'd like to discuss in a future episode of Cyber Focus, please contact the Center for International Business Education and Research here at the Kelley School.